Welcome to another episode of Balls in Your Face Marketing. I have with me today a very impressive guest. So stop what you're doing, strap on your thinking caps, because she has over 10 years of experience in the field of corporate marketing for wee little brands such as Pfizer, Nestle, Johnson & Johnson. If that doesn't impress you, she is also an award-winning speaker and professor holding positions at the Schulich School of Business, the DeGroote School of Business, and the University of Guelph. She has an HSBc, an MBA, and a PhD, having studied in neuroscience, psychology, marketing, and strategy. Today, she is very passionately dedicated to helping others by speaking about BBBB, building better business brains. Ladies and gentlemen, today with me, I have Dr. Brynn Winegard.
Doctor, please. Oh, yes, I'm in. Doctor, please. Oh, yes, I'm in.
Dr. Winegard, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Julian. Happy to be here.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine. I've been excited all day. My dopamine receptors are on fire. So let me dive right in, and let me maybe start with a few of the subjects that I've already spoken about a bit on this show. One being mindset and the importance of mindset, and how the way that we think about things, our attitudes, have an effect on our outcomes in life. Is that a fair thing to say? And if so, what is the science behind that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, your attitudes, how you set your mind, how your mind is set are part and parcel with not just your psychology, but of course with how in neuroscience we talk about neurons that fire together, wire together. And so the more you practice a neural pathway, which in your, according to your narrative could easily be a mindset or could be a philosophy or an attitude, the more those neural networks become reified and crystallized and lay down. And so you literally become your thoughts. And it's it's one of the more liberating and I want to say scary facts that neuroscientists have uncovered over the last sort of 25 years is that the thoughts you think, you plastically put down neurons for and neural networks for, which therefore literally become you. And so we're very used to the notion, I think, that you are the company you keep because you notice ways that you become like them. You are the food you eat. I mean, that makes sense to us on even just a physical level, right? That those macronutrients would become part of our physical makeup. But I mean, if you start to conceptualize philosophically, spiritually, theoretically, and then literally that you become your thoughts from a neuroscientific perspective, I think that is one of the more powerful comments you can make about, mindset and attitude and holding positive psychology and all of those, all of that. Yeah.
And that's something that you can change, right? Like I've read a little bit of another great Canadian doctor, Dr. Norman Deutsch, who talks about neuroplasticity. I mean, you can change how you think and perceive things, right?
Absolutely. And, Norman Deutsch I've done a book review for him. I mean, great example of the brain that changes itself is the idea is that there is a disconnect between mind and brain. They're not one and the same, but the fact is that the mind works on the brain and vice versa. And so, if you're careful of the thoughts that you allow into your mind, you do change your brain accordingly. And if if your brain has thoughts that it's surfacing into the mind, then, your mind and your brain work synonymously to change how it is that you see the world. And the thing is that the way that we see the world, all action, reaction, perception, everything is born and made inside your cranium, right? And so I often start in my talks, and I know you saw this, Julian, the quote from Walter Freeman that says, all the brain can know, it knows from inside of itself. And at first that seems limiting until what you realize is that it's absolutely liberating. The truth is that everything about your reality, your fate, what has been and what will be is decided upon inside your cranium. Now, not all of it under your conscious control. And when we think about our consciousness, we think about the mind, which we think is something at maximum worth about 5% of your bandwidth of processing power, and at minimum something closer to 1%. And so that means that the vast majority of what's happening inside all that it can know about itself, inside that cranium, is happening at the subconscious level. And so we've got just this huge amount of processing power and bandwidth and potential to change our own brain and potential to change our attitude and our own psychology and our own mindset. We have this huge bandwidth to do so that I don't think most of us realize, and I don't think most of us tap into on a regular basis.
I think it's really cool that you make that distinction too, by the way, between sort of the brain and the mind. And there's two things that come to mind. One are some studies that I read years ago, and this was more sort of anecdotal, some very sort of fascinating findings of people who would have transplants. Let's say, for example, a heart transplant, and somebody who, let's say, before the transplant, they hated carrots. And then all of a sudden they got a heart transplant and all of a sudden started to adopt some of the preferences of their donor heart who did love carrots. And I remember when you were speaking too, you were talking about, how many neurons are here or there, and you used the gut as one example as having a lot of neurons. So where is the mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the mind, colloquially, it can be within and without the body. So there are many instances in popular literature, as an example, and certainly in, some of the sort of pseudoscientific literature about the mind being a collective, right? That was Jung. Carl Jung talked about the collective unconscious, this idea that the mind is sort of a shared cultural collectivist concept. I think scientists and neuroscientists, certainly psychologists, don't consider very often, anymore anyway, we don't really conceptualize the mind as external to the body. We really think of it as internal to the individual and to one's own sort of habitus and person. And from a neuroscientific perspective, we conceptualize that the mind is in the conscious mind, effectively, in the conscious brain, rather. So that is mostly harbored in the prefrontal cortex. So if you touch your hand to your forehead, it's sort of in that orbital sphere that you would be holding onto in your hand. That's where we think the mind is. To your point, and to sort of address the earlier point, there's not just evidence that transplanting of organs, as an example, would change a person's preference in neural wiring, but that also there was the famous case of the C. difficile breakout, where what they figured out in order to stop what was a killer bacterial infection, effectively, C. difficile breakouts in hospitals, what they would do was fecal transplants, which is exactly as it sounds, disgusting as that may be. And there's a famous precedent-setting case in the US where a woman, thin all her life, fairly active, but a regular sort of fairly high basal metabolic rate, so fairly high metabolism. In other words, she looked phenotypically from the outside world fairly thin, fairly toned, without a ton of effort. She got a fecal transplant from an obese patient who, and there's the plot twists, but happens to be her own daughter, which actually scientifically is relevant because that means you can isolate the fact nature versus nurture. Anyway, the patient had been obese all of their life, etc., and the donor rather, and the recipient after, while the C. difficile had been controlled, finds that no matter the amount of exercise, dietary training, etc., she's now overweight and battling sort of this uphill battle with her weight that she'd never had before, and she's already in her 50s. So in a woman's 50s, we would expect that her metabolism has settled a few notches already, right? And so all factors controlled, guess what? It turns out that the biome, the microbiome or the microbiota that had been transplanted from another person, not just let alone a whole organ, has changed how that person's whole metabolic circumstance is, their, HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. So you're really looking at the composition metabolically as well as biotically of this person having changed almost completely over time with this donor, with this, with this transplant. And what's interesting about your heart example and the microbiota example is that it's very recent that the World Health Organization actually allowed and has constituted the microbiome, which is the constitution of all microbiota in your gut, as an organ onto itself, which has huge implications and ramifications for how we conceptualize the gut and its power in determining certainly the neurons that fire together and wire together, but a person's, biotic makeup and metabolic makeup, and therefore psychology and mindset and attitudes and behaviors and so on. So it's, infinitely sort of interesting to me, these examples that,
Yeah, absolutely.
there's a definitive, inextricable link between mind and body. And I think from a neuroscientist's perspective, that mind is held in the conscious brain, but basically that, listen, there's this organ called the brain, and it operates in symbiosis with all these other organs, and it acts on those organs, and equally and effectively, those organs act on the brain and on the mind. And I think that connection is sort of endlessly interesting.
Yeah, likewise. No, I find it absolutely fascinating. And one of the things that you and I got into a discussion about very early on when we first met was about Dr. Joe Dispenza, who brings into this discussion some sort of new research into quantum physics even. And he goes so far as to say that, you can almost think yourself out of illness. I mean, what are the limits? How powerful is this organ or is the mind?
Dr. Joe Dispenza, he talks a lot about, as you mentioned, that exact sort of connection, not just mind and body. He also connects it to spirituality and to soul, right? And to one's faith, as example, I think as a spiritual, faithful person himself. He wouldn't be in the minority. As an example, Norman Deutsch, who you mentioned earlier, would believe has evidence of, patients who have thought themselves through and away from illness. And the idea is that a lot of illness in our current concept of diagnostics, certainly in the medical profession and in the psychiatric profession, a lot of that illness is really, it starts with some of the psychosomatics, right? With some of how the brain is treating the body and what chemicals it washes the body and all of its cells in, and so and vice versa. And so, again, inextricably linked. And if we kind of imagine that there isn't such a dichotomy, if we imagine that we are very much an animal, that our brain is one organ amongst many, that they are all inextricably linked, that they affect and impact each other, we start to see it as, I would want to say, almost a complete homeostatic system. Mm-hmm. That then you realize a disease in one organ is not limited to that organ, even if, as an example, cancer is the best example, because both from an imaging perspective as well as from a diagnostic perspective, we localize that cancer. We say it's cancer of the something or other. But really, I like to systematize that and say it can't possibly be cancer of the, whatever the is, if this is all one system, if this is all an interconnected, inextricably linked system. And it is the patients who talk about their process in controlling the cancer and in getting rid of their cancer, they very typically will transcend exactly what I'm describing, which is this concept of the dichotomy between brain and body, or mind and body. And what they'll say is that, conceptualizing that meant that if those cells were going to be healthy, every cell had to be healthy. And if those cells were going to be changed and, stop rapidly mitotically dividing, then all cells had to have some mitotic control. And they started to conceptualize sort of the whole system in a much more homeostatic way, and tried to develop more equilibrium in that system. And that is where I think the Joe Dispenza stuff, the spirituality, the cosmos, the quantum physics of it all, that's where this really starts to enter in, is when they conceptualize that, listen, this is a systems theory, it's a systems thinking theory, but the idea is that if one organ is inextricably linked to all other organs, then all other organs are inextricably linked to their environment. And if they're all inextricably linked to their environment, then that environment is almost like Russian nesting dolls, inextricably linked to every other greater macro force and circumstance around it, right? So like you and I are in a city, and around that city is a state, and around that state is a country, and around that country is et cetera, et cetera. And you can get big until you're on this microspec called Earth, and there's this whole universe out there. So I think it's really the connection of all of those things that started to coalesce for the patients that have been interviewed, and that I've read the sort of journals of, if you will, that have come back and said, I really started to realize that it wasn't my liver in isolation of all other things. It was my liver in connection to all other things. And that's what cured the cancer ultimately, was conceptualizing that not only were they inextricably linked, but if they were, there was control to be had. And so taking back that control, and not in that intrinsic sort of sense of, here's what I can do about this, and here's how I can help my liver, as an example. I'm just using it as an example. And
I believe it. I mean, and you know, I mean, I've got my grandfather, I think, intuited all of this because, you know, when he was younger, he was run over by a truck, and I'll spare the gory details, but the doctor said it was going to be physically impossible for him to walk again. He ended up walking perfectly well, without the aids of any walking aids, without a limp, without anything. He suffered from, I think, 3 different types of cancer. That's not what did him in. What did him in was dementia.
Yeah.
Right? Like it was a disease of the mind ultimately, really, that ultimately got him. So I mean, I've witnessed this. And there's all kinds of other anecdotal evidence too, you know, when you see, you know, couples where one partner dies and then sort of very shortly after the other partner dies, it's as if, you know, they die of a broken heart. I've sort of witnessed that where people who have a strong will to live seem to survive through it, and people who kind of give up, unfortunately, pass a little more easily. So I mean, I believe for sure that, you know, I would not put a limit myself on what is possible. Let's bring it back to again, because you, as I mentioned off the top of this, that you talk about helping people build better business brains, and something that I've also spoken a bit about on this show is when we're talking about sales advice, that often, you know, in many cases, I don't think people buy from businesses so much as they buy from people, and people whom they know, like, and trust. So what are some tips and some advice and some of the science behind building those relationships?
Yeah. I mean, it's it's $1 billion question. You know, I think one of the predominant ways that I approach that is upon the realization that the vast majority of the human subconscious and even the conscious is dedicated to social processing. And so I joke, and you've probably seen me, you know, slides to this effect, but I say, listen, if Maslow knew brain science, he wouldn't have said that our physiological needs were first, or that our safety needs were first. He would have said, in fact, that our social needs are first. And while Maslow's long been disproven, if you look at even that hierarchy, we can see examples right in front of you at every stage of every day that are people compromising safety needs, physiological needs, even security needs for their social needs, right? So people will starve themselves to be thin to fit in. People will go into debt to get the better car, the bigger house, in order to keep up with the Joneses. I mean, we see evidence all the time that social needs are preeminent to every other need. And this is evidence, and not surprising when you conceptualize that humans, Homo sapiens, are fundamentally a social species, and that the biggest risk to your survival, certainly back in a hunter-gatherer period as example, would have been isolation from the group, would have been social isolation. And so social belongingness and fitting in and social capital and social equity become really the predominant and most important forms of equity or capital for a human, right? Because they need to fit in. And so it's sort of through that lens then that I say, well, there's all kinds of implications for how we would build a better business brain. And in this case, you know, selling, sure, relationships, sure, but there's tons of ways to build a better business brain. But it's through that social lens then that we say, well, what are some of the top, you know, insights we can drive? One of them, of course, is that, and this is why social media has been such a powerful invention over the last really 10 years, and really, you know, taken the world by storm, is that social proof ends up being one of the more sort of potent methods of marketing or of selling something, and of being able to solicit other people who are otherwise outside your tribe, who are not otherwise necessarily supposed to trust you or know you, or what I talk about, the 3 Bs, believe you, buy into your ideas, or buy your products. The believing, buying in, and buying, they're not supposed to do any of those things necessarily, but there are ways to circumvent or hijack the you know, neural circuits, the neural networks in charge of social processing that say, oh, actually, I can trust this random stranger. I can believe in them, buy into their ideas, and buy their products by virtue of as an example, conveyance of social proof. So they'll give you social proof, testimonials, reasons why others have trusted them, used their products, had success, believed in their ideas, and been better off for it. We hear this, we see this all the time with, and here's just another example, social exclusivity. Grant people social exclusivity, and we hijack the neural networks associated with social processing and preference in order to say, well, gosh, I really want to believe in this, buy into this, and buy this product. Things like airlines, right? Airlines have known for a long time, grant people zone 1 or zone 2. And they are much more happy to follow suit and to pay the extra premium and price. And that's really just about delivering social exclusivity, which is a proxy for social capital and social equity. And so, there's all these kind of little tips, tricks, tools I talk about, certainly in my talks, but then in a lot of my training around, what we can do better and differently in order to have people, to use people's social networks in a way that don't just help them realize better returns, but help us prove our point in the marketplace.
Mm-hmm. And I imagine that a lot of what you're saying also sort of applies in sort of the reverse of that. Instead of trying to sell to people, but from an HR perspective, how to attract the right people, how to recognize that they're the right people, and then how to ensure their success.
Absolutely. And so one of my most popular sets of training is around, not just talent acquisition so much as talent management, right? The idea that here we have these human resources, and how are we going to motivate them to do productive and profitable things? And so I talk a lot about performance and peak performance, motivation, productivity in people. And sometimes I'm talking to the audience as, the people who want to be more productive, but other times I'm talking to HR managers who, they need tips, tricks, and tools for how it is to make their people better, because it's not enough to say, hey guys, you got to be more motivated, right? Like that doesn't work. And the other thing that doesn't work, and this is the Daniel Pink stuff, he talks about, if you've not read Daniel Pink, you should have a little gander, because I think you'd really enjoy in the industrial era, it was sort of enough in factories to give people what he calls carrot and stick incentives. But the idea was, if you process more widgets, you get more money. The challenge with today's day and age in a post-industrial era is that the vast majority of us are not on the farm or in the factory. I talk about being on the farm or in the factory. We are knowledge workers. And so that's when the brain science really matters a lot more, because we are using our brain to produce every day, not our bodies. And as we've left sort of bodily production of things and physically doing stuff with our hands, the vast majority of our economies are propped up by knowledge work and not body work. Our brains become a lot more important, and motivating the brain is a lot different than motivating work done by the body. And said differently, now we need intrinsic motivations that are about our ability to contribute, and our concept of, contribution, and our concepts around mastery, and our concepts around, and this is Daniel Pink talks about mastery and autonomy, the idea that you're really looking to make a contribution in a different way. And so motivating workers that don't work with their bodies, but instead work with their brains is, not just topical now, but destined to be even more topical as we move forward, and absolutely what I do a ton of sort of discussing with different organizations.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because that's something that I've spoken a lot about too, about, the changes in the economy, that the sort of old, exactly as you were talking about, the sort of old industrial model really doesn't apply anymore. I've seen predictions that we're moving so much more towards a gig economy, a freelance economy, where, the lower end of the estimates that I've seen are 34% of the workforce will be freelance by 2020. The higher predictions are around 50%. So I think exactly as you're saying, in terms of those companies that do remain and do thrive, how are they going to hold on to good employees? And then how does that 34 to 50% survive and thrive on their own in this new economy? I think all of this is important. And I think those individuals, that's sort of the appeal to them, is exactly they get to handle their own development, their own education. And there's so much that they can accomplish online now. But that's going to be, I think, so their lives, I have a feeling, are going to become very appealing to the worker. And therefore, those companies are going to have to wrap their heads around that in order to retain those good employees so that they don't go rogue, that they don't go on their own or find better opportunities.
Yeah, well said. I think I've even seen it mapped onto the millennial generation, and that the, technology has really facilitated a gig economy and a gig sensibility around developing one's career, and the idea that as millennials sort of become not just the masters of the labor force, but then, younger generations from there, the idea that this sort of old corporate industrial complex is starting to fall down. As what are the averages now? People will have 5 careers in their lifetime or something, right?
Yeah,
like the
least,
idea.
Yeah.
We don't live to work, we work to live, and we don't have, we're not just we don't have the same kind of we don't work for the same company all of our lives and hope for benefits and so on. As a lot of that has sort of dismantled itself, and so has the loyalty, but with the lack of loyalty has increased entrepreneurship and therefore gig economies. And it's amazing. It's very interesting, super interesting times if you look at the future of work, for sure. I mean, just in general.
Yeah. No, absolutely. One of the things that I thought was very interesting when I saw you speak was that you started to talk about the different parts of the brain, and you talked about what a visual species we are. I certainly have experienced this from a multimedia background, and I look at some of the research, that when you create a video, for example, with an effective script that has appropriate visuals and the right words popping up, that the retention levels go way, way up in comparison to other forms of communication. But what I found very interesting about in that conversation was that, you were talking about how men, for example, in comparison to women, are much more visual. And this is maybe a contentious subject these days, is there a male versus female brain, or is that a social construct, as some suggest?
You could argue it either way, but we do know, as an example, that sort of historically male brains and female brains differ, right? And so gender is definitely a sociocultural construct, but you could probably show a neuroscientist, with few exceptions, you could show them an MRI, fMRI of a brain, and they could tell you if that brain identifies as male or female predominantly. So that is to say that there are known sort of neural areas that are differential according to male and female, spectrum, if you will.
Right.
And certainly that males are designed to be more visually oriented. That said, I mean, even in a female, of the 5 senses, it's definitely the predominant one in humans is visual sense. And something upward of a quarter of all of your neurons are dedicated to visual processing and the results thereof. So that whole, if you touch the back of your head, kind of where a woman would put her bun, that part that protrudes is all the visual cortices. And they're predominant of the human 5 senses in sighted people. And what that means is that, there's a lot of ramification there as well, or implication there as well, for how we can consider marketing and sales and, as you quite rightly point out, retention and impressions and actual, willingness to pay attention, which we are all vying for attention these days, right? Like this is so hard to get people's attention in what is otherwise just such a cluttered environment. But especially males definitely like visual stimuli, and they prefer visual stimuli that move, that are dynamic. So we know that males have more neurons at the beginning of their life and develop them as they go for dynamic imagery, which is why it's typical to see males, as an example, who appreciate and are more likely to interact with things like video games at younger ages than a female would necessarily. I mean, that's not to say she doesn't have the freedom of choice, the freedom of will, but all to say that he's neuroscientifically predisposed to video in all of its formats, including that he can interact with, because we also know that males are predisposed also to more physical movement, rough and tumble play, physical interactivity. And so that video games are a perfect sort of phenomenon for that, where it's both dynamic imagery and movement on a screen that includes interactivity and the simulation of play and physical activity. And so that all of those things are good examples of neural circuitry that definitely are predominant in males, not exclusive of males, of course.
Of course not. Of course not. And then and conversely, like for example, like certainly when you talk about child play, so the oversimplification that I would say is that men, generally speaking, are often sort of oriented towards things. Women are a little more oriented towards relationships. But I mean, imagine there's all kinds of sort of differences between the two. What are things that men can do to up their strengths in the areas that women are maybe strong in, and vice versa? What are things that women can do that to up their strengths in what men are, or is that even desirable?
Yeah, and I wouldn't describe them. The problem, I guess, with the question therein is what's implied is that there are strengths, differential strengths. I guess there are, but I don't know that there are ways necessarily that they couldn't just overcome what you might conceptualize as a difference in the mean between the genders, let's say, just by virtue of wanting to. So a male can certainly with ease decide that he is going to as you mentioned, have more inclination towards interpersonal or emotional sensibilities, and vice versa. A female can with ease decide that she's going to pick up a video game and become good at it. So I think it's really about proclivities that when we see very young children, as an example, proclivities that they have sort of naturally by nature, quote unquote. We know that nature and nurture are inextricable, but there's some examples of what a little boy will generally sort of pick up versus what a little girl would naturally pick up with no preceding conditioning or acculturation. And it's consistent across cultures, but it's easy to override because effectively humans still have that free will. They can say, listen, if a boy for whatever reason is very interested in the emotional intelligence of other, or like the emotional lives of others and the interconnectivity and the psychology and the sort of interpersonal skills he'd have to develop in order to be good at that, he does that with ease. And there's lots and lots of examples of what we always say in social science when this is interesting is that the variation within the population is always greater than the variation between the populations. And that's from so the means are actually closer together on the spectrum of data than the two kind of bumps in the charts, as an example, are sort of closer together than you might expect. And so what that means is that on average, you're going to see females clustered around a mean, but that within that cluster, there's going to be a ton of overlap with the males.
I think it's a very important point that you're making there, actually, because I think sometimes it's something that people get a fair bit confused, right? That, for example, when it's, if you were to take a population of 100 people and you randomly select one male, one female, and were to bet as to which one might be more inclined towards or have a greater strength in one area than another, exactly as you're saying, the odds are much closer. It's going to be, let's say 60-40 or whatever. It's when you look at the extremes, right? If you take a population of 1,000 and say, okay, who is going to be the most in one? That's where then those differences become more prevalent. So, for example, I'll take men being tend to be maybe more aggressive than women. Well, exactly as I said, if you were to take one male, one female, and bet who's going to be, the more aggressive, it's going to be something like a 60-40 split. But if I were to take out of a group of 1,000, say who's the most aggressive out of all of them, very higher chance that that's going to be men. That's why I think there's more men in prison, for example.
I mean, it could be, right? It could also be sociocultural construct. The other thing is that in that very specific case happens to be the dissertation I did 25 years ago about how we define aggression, because we know that males and females are differentially aggressive. So males are physically aggressive, whereas females are interpersonally, socially, and emotionally aggressive. And so if we define aggression as the physical act of being, of being hostile towards someone, then Yes, and very typically that's how we define it in our culture. If, however, we started to classify aggression the way it should probably be classified, which is hostility of any kind towards someone else, we start to see that females are definitely purveyors of that type of aggression. So yeah, I mean, all this down to the definition and the variables, but I think fundamentally, if you consider two normal curves on the same graph, what you'd see is that the means are fairly close together, all things considered, and that there is a ton of overlap between males and females. Now, when I say that a neuroscientist if you gave me an fMRI, you could probably tell what it is we're considering a lot of different variables, including the size of the actual brain itself, right, which is bigger in males typically, what is lit up based on certain stimuli, et cetera. So a lot of factors that go into that, where you could probably be fairly predictive. But yes, in general, I mean, there are differences, and then there are a lot more similarities than there are differences between males and females.
Right, right. Do you, and this is again I'm certainly treading in some very touchy, well, it's just these days that people get pretty touchy about this stuff, but what's your take on legislators trying to sort of enforce diversity and diversity quotas? I mean, should they be doing that, or should we just sort of let nature take its course?
That's a good question. I really haven't thought about that much. And I certainly haven't thought about it much I've thought much more about, not so much about sort of policy and legislation. I've thought more about kind of the science of how it is that we can aid as sort of to your earlier question, how it is that we can aid anyone to be more, I don't know, valuable to their employer, let's say, and to learn more and to be more knowledgeable. I've given really very little thought to the policy that stems from that, but it's a good question. It's probably a question for someone else.
Okay, well, yeah, no, fair enough. It's something that I read so much about these days, and it's interesting to speak to somebody from the science background into about, you know, what are those natural differences versus, as you bring in, you know, the cultural, sociocultural, because again, and I agree too, it's such a that debate of nature and nurture has been going on forever, so it's so complicated, but it's always interesting to kind of come from you know, to get that sort of scientific perspective, and again, I just, for me, it's at least interesting to get some recognition or acknowledgement of the fact that there are differences that happen, that occur naturally, and therefore,
I'll give you my example of the sort of extent to which I think about policy, and one of them is as it relates to kind of the stuff that I do research on, and it's something I've been doing a lot of research on very recently, but it is the developmental differences in learning modus or modi for boys versus girls. Again, like I just refer to it from a biological perspective of female male, but the idea is that boys learn typically very differently than females. And so what's interesting is we see in all kinds of pedagogical research, in all kinds of different areas of literature, from education to neuroscience to psychology to developmental theories, the fact that schools, the way they're currently set up, actually disadvantage boys, especially younger boys. So schools, the way that we have developed them in Western culture, are really not very advantageous for boys. In fact, they're sort of systemically and systematically disadvantaging for boys. And so, like, there's an example of where I haven't thought about diversity initiatives so much as I've thought about learning and knowledge and, you know, how it is that we can kind of do better based on our brain science information in order to get people to learn more profitably. So there's an example of, like, from that perspective, then I have gone all the way to think about how we might alter policy and what that looks like. But basically, just to state it very simply, I mean, schools are not designed for boys. They're not conducive to young male brain development and learning. Or said differently, the young male developing brain does not do particularly well in the context of our sort of westernized concept of a classroom.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, well, so I guess what you, again, I don't know if that is so much a policy issue as a educational strategy. So you're basically would advocate for different educational strategies for boys versus girls.
which certainly could ascend to the level of policy and legislation. But yeah, no, that's the idea, is that sitting down, being quiet, facing forward, listening to an authoritative podium speaker command for long periods of unabated attention is really not something that any human brain is designed for, but especially not what a young male brain is designed for. And so there's good research that shows as example that a boy who is asked to sit down, face forward, have no physical activity, completely in a sedentary environment with lots of stimuli he can't respond to, and then ask him to attend to it in the first place, and then intake information, and then encode that information into a neural network, it's like near impossible. Whereas it's very hard for girls, and we forget how hard learning can be and how uncomfortable it's supposed to be. Like, learning is physically challenging, it's physically draining, it's psychologically draining. But what we forget is that, especially for boys, that is not natural at all to how they would normally have learned, or how they would, and by normally, I mean back in the EEA, we call it the era of evolutionary adaptedness, or evolutionary era of adaptedness. But either way, the EEA, we learned that boys need to move. And so there's research that shows that in a classroom, experimental classroom, where boys were asked to just walk around the classroom instead of sitting in a chair, but just walk around reading or being taught something, their rates of attention went up. Again, more dynamic movement, right? More neurons for dynamic insight, etc. Their attention went up, their retention went up, their learning went up, the number of neural networks that actually encoded the information increased. So boys, it turns out, need not be seated face forward, shut up, don't move, don't touch, don't talk, etc. They need to physically be more active than that. And so, again, why the classroom doesn't really service anybody, because even with females, teaching 25 or 30 or 40 at a time is not enough personalized attention for them each. Everyone has different learning moda as well. So like, someone might prefer visual, most of us prefer practical, right? We learn by doing, we learn hands-on. Others are, tactile, et cetera, et cetera. So all to say that basically classrooms disadvantage learners, but they disadvantage male learners the most. And there's really good research that shows that.
It's interesting because, when you talk about sort of an approach that caters to the way our brains work, one of the things that I've sometimes wondered about, when I grew up as a kid, it was the early days of Sesame Street. And Sesame Street, had recognized the sort of shorter attention spans of children. And so they made sure that every segment was no longer than 30 seconds. Mm-hmm. But now I sit back and I wonder, well, was that helping us? Is that what has been a cause of us having shorter and shorter attention spans?
I don't know. It's a good question. The jury's out. I think to some extent, technology and TV, having been an early technology, have definitely changed. And so what we see is, over the last 7 years is a good example. Technology has changed more than in all of the history of the earth, right? So we've seen this acceleration of the rate at which technology changes. I mean, by the time you have the iPhone 7, the iPhone 8 is out. Like, it's so fast, it's so rapid, no one can keep up, certainly not a human brain. And actually, it's a professor named Susan Greenfield, who, funny enough, is a duchess, but serious. She has a doctorate. She's a very serious professor. She's very good in neuroscience. She wrote a book called Mind Change, which is all about younger generations and digital technologies having changed our attention spans. And so I don't know exactly how old you are, Julian, but if you remember Sesame Street, then gives me an indication that your attention span is probably somewhere in the range of about 7 seconds, whereas millennials coming up now who've witnessed this drastic acceleration in technological obsolescence are somewhere closer to the 3 second mark. And so technology has shortened our attention spans, and it's working on every generation, by the way. It's working continually on you and I. It's working on older generations. The boomers are attending less and less, have less and shorter attention spans. But this is in marked contrast to, let's say, the Victorian era, when it was conceptualized that humans had something closer to 10 to 12 seconds of working attention span. So we are condensing how conditioned we are to rapidly changing stimuli into a world that kind of has us constantly code switching and constantly scanning and panning our environment in order to detect new stimuli and new things. And that is, largely because of things like television and computers and the internet and digital technologies.
No, and that evolution, that sort of constant rapid growth again I think you're referring to sort of like Moore's law, that the growth of it is exponential. It just keeps on going faster and faster and faster. And I'm glad that you're bringing some of this up, because I have two small kids, and I worry sometimes watching them play with their iPads. Am I right to sort of want to limit their time with that?
I think so. Also because good research shows that it doesn't just create addiction, which has all the trappings of addiction. Like we didn't used to have, for minors, we used to have a lot more sanctions that kept them from addictive substances while their brains were still developing, right? So we didn't give kids coffee or caffeine. We didn't feed kids cigarettes or alcohol. Like there were laws about how old you had to be to consume addictive substances, except for not digital technologies. We haven't governed that at all yet. And it's partly because digital technologies have advanced quicker than policy can, which is effectively to say that, we are conditioning addictive behavior. It would be addictive, no different than alcohol or gambling. And further to that, there is great evidence to show that more screen time early in life leads to higher rates of depression and anxiety through puberty and later in life. And so, I think it's less screen time is better for kids just in general.
Good to know. And so I'm 44, by the way. So I remember the days when there weren't that many channels. You had to go up to the TV if you wanted to change it, and you had to be there at the time of the show when you wanted to see it. None of this on-demand stuff. So a lot has changed just in my lifetime, let alone my parents' or grandparents' generations. Fascinating. So, what out of respect for your time, what are some of your last your big tips for building better business brains?
It's a good one. I think one of the more recent pieces of research that has been very heavily popularized, so I'll parrot it because why not? It's the idea that our best brain hours are not sort of dispersed. And I think when you connect all of the dots, right? So all the Daniel Pink stuff and all of the neuroscience literature and all of the insights about males versus females and connect all of it, what you realize is that what's interesting is a lot of how our sort of industrialized work life has been set up is not one that is conducive to brain work. And so when we look to brain work and how people can use their brains better, one of the key tips I always say is it's in fact the early hours of the day are the best brain hours you have. And so there's great research, and there's a book out just recently called Rest by Pang that talks about the fact that the brain is obviously, it is energetically extremely expensive. It's your most expensive organ, and it has a limit on its available output in the day. In fact, and this is the stuff that I research, it has a limit much faster, much sooner. You reach your brain limit for the day much faster than your body limit for the day. And so what's interesting is that I always say, if you want to be most productive, don't work out first thing in the day. Don't work out first thing in the morning. Then what you're doing is you're using your best energy, your best brain time for physical body-based activities and not for your brain activities. And so what I say is start, in fact, with the toughest job that you have to do that day. I call it eating your frogs for breakfast. Don't do the administrative things. Don't do your email. Don't do your, we kid ourselves into thinking that we're warming up to the priority of the day, whatever the big thing is you're supposed to get done. Don't do any of that. Start early in the morning without not working out, but with, in fact, doing your brain work. That's going to help you. And do the toughest thing first, because that's also going to help you for many reasons. So there's all kinds of, you release a bunch of dopamine when you're done and serotonin, and that actually helps you propel you through the rest of your day. And there's good research that shows that your maximum amount of brain effort you're going to be able to put into a day is probably all in succession. And it's probably in, 90-minute increments at maximum with 20-minute breaks. And it's for 4 hours total. And so what it means is that your brain is much more tireable. It gets tired much quicker than your body. So wake up early, do the biggest thing first, do the brain work first, take breaks as you need, and then give yourself a break come 10 a.m. or so, and then do the body work, do the working out later in your day. And so sort of a perfectly structured day is one where you're up and working early in the morning with less distractions. You're doing the toughest thing first at sort of 6:30 in the morning, 6 o'clock, 6:30 in the morning. And then, during the day, you're doing your meetings and your emails and your correspondences, and you're having your other, the other stuff that doesn't require a ton of brain time. And then by end of day, you're working out, and then you have your biggest meal of your day after your workout, and then you're early to bed and early to rise. And so some of this, again, it's a coalescence of all of this research that really says we have to rethink, I think, our industrialized concept of the workday in order to be most productive. Because the truth is that we don't work with our bodies anymore. We work with most of us, certainly probably the people listening to your podcast and most of the people that I deal with every day, certainly myself and yourself, we work with our brains. And so we want to be more productive. We're going to prioritize energy for our brain first, and then do our working out and our exercise, which is critical for brain health. But we'll do that later in the day. We'll do the body work later. Brain work first, body work later.
Interesting. And that's great because I think that's probably, as you're saying, that is sort of counter to what a lot of people have been told or taught, that, hey, you do some exercise in the morning and that sort of gives you more energy for the rest of the day. But what you're saying is, in fact, that has been disproven.
Yeah, and it's funny because I get audience members often who come up and go, oh my goodness, Eureka, I've been working out with my trainer at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I've got to tell you, I'm dead tired by 10:30 in the morning, and my afternoon is a complete wash, don't tell my boss, and I'm dragging myself through the rest of my day, and then I'm exhausted come evening, and then I lie my head down to the pillow, and my head, and as exhausted as I feel, my brain is going crazy, and I can't stop thinking, which is a classic sign of serotonin deficiency, as an example. And so if you don't have enough serotonin, you can't get enough melatonin, which means you can't sleep, you can't fall asleep, you don't have enough of the hormone that lets you kind of go into that sleepful state. And so if you reverse all that, you actually increase your serotonin come the completion of the task, you increase your dopamine throughout the day, you increase how much you're actually getting done and how satisfied you are with what you've gotten done. Then you work out, you use up the rest of that excess energy, and you are easy to sleep by 9 p.m. You have, have more serotonin. Hopefully you've eaten the precursors, enough of the precursors. And then your stress levels decrease, your productivity goes up, your satisfaction levels go up. One of the things that I often joke about is that it's true that you need to, during the day when you feel tired, that's when you should, contrary to how our offices are set up or what often a lot of corporations would like to see, that's when you should go and socialize with your coworkers, because we know, and there's all kinds of research that shows that people who like who they work with will stay longer in the organization, will feel more connected to their work, will feel higher levels of satisfaction with not just the workplace and the employer, but also with the actual work they get done. And it's when you should daydream while it looks like the body is doing nothing, like that person is in la la land. In fact, that's when most daydreaming is when most eureka moments happen, right? It's when most people connect the dots, especially in creative workforces. It's when most people come up with the sort of, I've been looking for that answer for 3 days. So daydreaming is really important. So it's sort of important to, I think, honor that circadian rhythm. And when the brain is telling you that you don't have any more fuel left, that you're running on steam, you are. And to push yourself through is to create the circumstances and the context for a hotbed for burnout and for adrenal fatigue and for all kinds of other cascade of circadian and hormonal problems that will decrease your productivity over time, increase your burnout levels, decrease your satisfaction levels, increase your stress levels, your cortisol levels, etc., that really do impede your ability to get the good work done and to feel happy and good about all of that.
Amazing. Oh my gosh. Dr. Winegard, thank you so much. I mean, the amount of information that is in there, I think people are going to have to rewatch this a little over and over again a few times. But there's so much great advice, so many great tips. Eat your frogs for breakfast. More Mark Twain, a little less trainers. I appreciate this so much. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Julian. Thanks for having me.
I've got big